Good evening. My name is Amy McDonald. I'm the director of City Space, and I welcome our small in-person audience and our much larger virtual audience. And I look forward as in the future that more people are comfortable gathering in person. This is part of our This Changes Everything series, where we examine all the ways the pandemic has affected our lives and our society. And tonight we're talking about restaurants. Almost more than any other industry, the restaurant industry was hit so hard by the pandemic. It's always been held together by a frayed thread that the pandemic only exacerbated. No health insurance for many, high cost of rents for owners, and now inflation and a global shipping crisis impacting the supply of what a chef can even put on the menu, let alone worrying about whether customers will show up and be nice. Not to tonight at City Space, join us as how we explore how the restaurant industry could and should be rebuilt. If you have any questions for this panel, please go to slido.com and type in hashtag This Changes Everything, no spaces. And thank you to everyone who's already submitted. We have some excellent questions from the audience tonight. I'm delighted to introduce our panel, Katrina Jazayari, co-owner of Juliet and Company, Jamila Ruiz, the communication director of Raise One Fair Wage, who will be a little late. She's coming from the North Shore. I guess there was a very bad accident, and when she arrives, we'll just bring her right up on the stage. And Boston's renowned chef Jody Adams, owner of Porto, Trade, and Saloniki Greek, and the co-founder of Massachusetts Restaurant United. I'd also like to introduce our wonderful moderator, Irene Lee, co-founder of Boston's May Restaurant Group. Irene is our other interlocutor for our curated cuisine series. We'll be posting our winter 2022 season soon. We've got some great chefs lined up, so check it out and see who else Irene will be interrogating. Without further ado, over to you, Irene.
Thank you so much, Amy. Good evening, everyone. For the folks at home, thank you so much for joining us. And I just want to say, first of all, that for me, this is just a great excuse to talk to Jody and Katrina, who I admire so much. And so I hope you'll take advantage of this opportunity to ask them any questions that you have. So Jody, I want to start with you. COVID happened, still happening, and you have really been at the forefront of trying to keep not just your own restaurants, but our entire industry moving. Could you tell us a little bit about how you co-founded Mass Restaurants United and what that work is all about?
I'm happy to do that, Irene. But I think, yeah, it is really fun to just hang out. We haven't done this, we used to do this all the time, like just hang out and talk, and not do it with a Zoom screen. So I'm thrilled to be here with this audience and all of you out there in cyber world. On March 15th, we were told that we had to close our restaurants. And we had no idea what that meant, but we had to close the doors and we couldn't let anybody in. Really scary, and like took our breath away. And when we said, okay, so then what? What do we do with our staff? What do we do with our product? What about insurance? Business interruption insurance? No, sorry, no business interruption insurance. There was no plan. There were nothing answers for us. So many of us locally and across the country picked up the phone and talked to peers and said, what are we going to do? What's going on? Who's going to help us? How are we going to get what we need? What do we need? And there were a group of 6 of us, my business partner, John Mendez, Tony Maas, Michael Leviton, Ken Oranger, and Jamie B. Sinet. It just happened that the 6 of us ended up talking to each other, and we ended up talking 3 times a week, and came up with a list of needs in consulting with people like Katrina and Irene and everybody else in the city. What are the things that restaurants need? And we wrote a letter to the governor, and it got a lot of attention. And then we got some help actually learning how to write that kind of a letter. But we got, I think, 250 or so signatures, and it was clear that independent restaurateurs in Massachusetts needed a voice, and needed a voice to be at the table with elected officials, with the governor, with senators and representatives. And so we took it on. And at one point we said, should we start a real organization? It didn't have a name. It was just sort of us talking. Should we make a real organization? And I was like, I'm out of here. Nope, not me, not me, not me. I'm, you know, I've done that. I don't want to do that. And now I'm the co-chair of the organization. So, and we've done great work. And it wasn't us single-handedly, but collectively, restaurateurs in Massachusetts got a cap on delivery fees, cocktails to go, patio extensions, all kinds of grants, you know, because we communicated the need. And then at the national level with the Independent Restaurant Coalition, we fought, I mean, the singular fight was for saving restaurants with the Restaurants Act and getting the delegation here in Massachusetts on board. And every single one of them co-sponsored, ultimately, which was incredible. So we didn't get I can't remember the original ask. It was over $100 billion. We got 28.6 billion, I believe. We're still fighting for that 60 billion, 60 additional billion dollars, because it's needed. And I'm just going to start with a little bit of a dark note, and then we can go up from there. And that is that it indicated that 86% of restaurants across the country who applied for the Restaurant Relief Fund who did not receive it will close their doors by the new year. So that's how much we continue to really need the money. And we were talking in the green room about how important those grants were to all of us to keep the machines of our restaurants going.
And one of the really, I think, interesting and troubling things about the restaurant revitalization grants, number one, some restaurants got everything they asked for, and a lot of restaurants got nothing. So there was no way of kind of spreading the wealth, as it were. And then we also have lots of restaurants that didn't even pass the means test. The means test for the restaurant revitalization funds was that you had to have lost revenue from 2019 compared to 2020. But a lot of restaurants, especially the really small neighborhood restaurants, they just hustled their butts off to try to join Uber Eats, to do community feeding, to take on all these things that made their revenue look really high, and then all of a sudden they're being told that these funds are not for them.
Yeah, that was I mean, so mishandled. I mean, such a huge mistake, because there are little mom and pop places that did that were keeping their restaurants going in order to employ their staff, because the staff really needed the funds. Whereas, yeah, I mean, Trade is a restaurant of mine that did not open until 2.5 months ago, and we got those dollars because we showed no sales. We couldn't, it was in the financial district, didn't make any sense to open. Whereas our other restaurants that were up and going didn't receive the same kind of funding. It's really, it was out of whack.
Yeah. And Katrina, I want to turn to you because you had some really exciting plans for Juliet and Company. You had just opened, it seemed like, your second restaurant, Peregrine. You had plans to expand. What happened, and how are you moving through such a big blow to your business?
Yeah, well, first, I want to thank Jody and the others who worked to give us the voice that independent restaurant owners and operators were, you know, head down trying to make the food, try to figure out, should you get on this platform, you know, all of the daily operations amidst what am I doing with my team, and where are they living, and do they have food, and all these things, to then think, well, yes, we should do something, you know, larger as an industry, but who's got the time? So thank you so much for taking what little time you had to be that voice, because it's so important. You know, we've tried to do our part in our 6 years of being a business to kind of advocate for the things that we care about, because we realize that there's a huge spectrum of capacity to think outside of your four walls, but we all exist in a very connected ecosystem. I think that's one of the things that we've certainly learned. I've certainly, maybe not learned, but have been reminded of very deeply that we are all so connected. And so, lost my train of thought a little bit, but so we were, because of coming out of 2019, we had our first restaurant, Juliet, in Somerville, just turned 5. We were about to think about growth and let's get a bigger space, and what are all the possibilities that we're going to have now that we've reached adolescence and we have some financial stability. And in some ways, I mean, in all ways, we were very lucky to get to that point, because when COVID hit, my partner and I were able to say, okay, well, now this is what we're doing. Like, we're dealing with COVID response. If we had still been, the server and line cook the way we had been even 18 months prior to COVID in the restaurants, doing the work of the restaurants, there's no way that we could have had the kind of impact that we tried to have for our team and for our communities. So we were able to turn that focus to say, okay, we've got, 15, 20% of our workforce is ineligible for, unemployment insurance relief for whatever set of reasons. We are going to fund it for them so that you're not, you can't just lose your paycheck. So we were happily, in retrospect, positioned to have that time to give to the new set of concerns. In 2019, we were hoping that it would be expansion and growth. And that kind of got put on hiatus for about 2 years, but I'm happy to report that in spite of all of that uncertainty, we went ahead and took on a new lease, and in maybe 2 months, we will be reopening Juliet in a bigger space, a more well-equipped space, and really to kind of guarantee and shore up our ability to withstand the next thing that kind of, shakes the industry. Who knows what that is? Hopefully it's nothing like the COVID situation again, but, I think we're all very aware that we're well placed in restaurants to be dynamic and to kind of think about change and respond to it the best way we can. And so I think thinking about how we set ourselves up in combination with, whether it's government programs or local programs that kind of try to strengthen and give some resilience that we were lucky to kind of participate in and have had been able to create over time, that not every restaurant certainly could say the same.
Right. And I want to emphasize to everyone here and joining us from home that your restaurants are open right now, and I'm sure you'll all be running there right after this. I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about what the diner experience in your restaurant is like right now. How is it different? How is it the same? What might they be seeing inside those 4 walls? Jody, we'll start with you.
It's funny, it's sort of morphed into feeling extremely normal, except for the fact that our staff is wearing masks. Customers don't. They try to remember when they get up from the table. The staff definitely wears masks, and that's really it. I mean, we don't have any dividers between tables. We don't have huge distances between tables. We At Porto, which is a restaurant in Back Bay that has an amazing patio and was doubled in the spring of 2020. So we were able to do incredible numbers with that patio, and still, like tonight, I bet they have the patio open. Last year at this time, as people were coming indoors and it was getting warmer, we saw it was like the needle went like this, and the dollars, like we were burning money. And by the December 31st of 2020, we had to close. We had lost so much money between November, December, and we didn't reopen until April. This year, it's not as scary. Not as dire. And we reopened trade about 2.5 months ago, I think, beginning of September. Is that 2.5 months ago? And people are coming in. They're coming in and gathering in the bar. It feels quite normal. So fingers crossed that people are vaccinated and responsible. And I know that when we came in here, our vaccination cards were. We showed our cards. We don't do that at our restaurant. I don't know if you do it at your restaurants. It's, it's really tricky. There haven't been any sort of real guidelines except, with the mask mandate, then we knew what to do. So to answer your question, it feels really exciting. It feels new and fresh. I'm also, as I told you earlier, I'm back in the kitchen in a way that I haven't been in 15 years, rolling up my sleeves, butchering chickens and fish, and making sauces, and working with the team, and running up and down the stairs.
There's no better time to go to one of Jody's restaurants than right now.
Well, trade is where I am, so I'm there like 14 hours a day. So, and I'm loving it, but I do feel it. But that's the difference, when not in terms of what COVID did in terms of psychology, I think in terms of restaurants. I remember thinking when we all shut our doors and I started getting on these calls, these IRC calls, and the calls had chefs from all over the country, super high profile chefs. And I thought, celebrity chef? No more. Like, there was no platform. So it really brought everybody to this place of, we are all in this together. As Katrina said, we're all interconnected, and how are we going to work together? What do we need to do? And how can we stay connected? And the fact that I'm back in the kitchen in the way that I am makes me feel like I'm back where I belong, like where I started. And I was Jacques Pepin, who was teaching right around the corner, a few weeks ago came to my restaurant when I was in the kitchen, and I came out, and I was, I could only come out for a minute because I had to go back and expedite, or I don't know, peel garlic or something. And he said, you're in the kitchen. And I said, yeah. He said, all those guys who left the kitchen, I always wondered, like, what happens if you have to go back into the kitchen? That's where I am.
I love that. Katrina, what's dining at Peregrine like right now?
Dining at Peregrine, Peregrine is inside the Whitney Hotel on Charles Street, so we had sort of a different experience there where people, travel was a big, had a big impact, or the lack of travel on that dynamic. So, in the early months, it was sort of like a ghost town of like, we had been open for 8 months before the pandemic hit, so we didn't have kind of the regulars that we do have at our Somerville restaurant. And so it was kind of desolate for a while there, but the patio, kind of the expediting of getting patios opened, allowed us to get some headway with the neighborhood, who let us start serving food in outdoor areas that we were prohibited from serving food previously. And the response has been so wonderful, and we have this amazing, I guess I'm outing this lovely secret on Charles Street, but we have this beautiful courtyard that's really an oasis from a busy intersection, that, you can sit outside, have a cup of coffee, have your whole dinner by the fire pit. It's really one of those, there are a few things that I won't say I'm happy for COVID, but I appreciate these things that we've gotten to do because of this crisis that I hope don't go away. So outdoor dining being, I live in Union Square in Somerville, and to see the streetscapes look so much more kind of vibrant, and you meet your neighbors and you see people, is, to me so exciting. And I hope we never go back to just parking spaces everywhere. There's such a better use of land, in my opinion. But we also didn't do any of the like plastic barricades or dividers in the restaurant. We took out a lot of our tables to do the distancing and the capacity restrictions when those were in place. But we kind of asked ourselves, like, is the experience of this restaurant one that should happen behind a sheet of plastic? And we sort of said, like, no, we could do that, but that experience is so different from what we wanted to create, that we sort of never did that. So if you walk in now, aside from the team wearing masks, you wouldn't know. So it feels normal in that way. We've had like, the thing that I think feels the most different is sort of an absence of something now, when we had all of these like waves of restrictions and guidelines, and it seemed to me like every Friday a new restriction would be put on or one would be taken away with no notice. And then the restaurant workers are responsible for upholding those requirements that were a surprise, and like we didn't really have a say in, which is fine. We're not public health officials, but we no longer have to do that level of like community enforcement. So that is a big weight off of our shoulders.
I want to jump quickly to another aspect of the diner's experience. The QR code came back from the dead during COVID. I had never used one before myself. It's an older technology. We're now putting it to new use. But the QR code is symbolic of a lot of things that are going on under the surface in the supply chain. So we are going to take a listen to part of an interview from WBUR's Here and Now, interviewing reporter Mark Stewart, and then we'll chat a little bit more about that.
Originally, the rationale was it would be one less thing to touch, one less opportunity to pick up germs. But now restaurants are still using the QR codes, but the reasoning is a little bit different. They're not choosing to print menus because they're having to make changes so often. Sometimes they don't know what is coming in their daily shipment until it arrives, and that will impact the menu choices. So yet another sign of innovation and necessity here.
So I'm curious if either of you want to shout out any supply chain issues that you've faced in the restaurants. And I'm also curious about, the increased cost of so many things. You can still get gloves, but they cost about twice as much as they used to. And so how are you dealing with those increased costs? And I guess I'm also wondering, can we really pass those expenses on to the customer, and how are we communicating about that? Hi, Shamila. Katrina, have you had any strange encounters with the supply chain recently?
Not super recently. One from the middle of the COVID was about patio heaters. I'm sure lots of restaurants had that similar, trying to find something that would allow you to operate your business. and everyone needing it at the same time. It's echoes of, labor, which we'll touch on at some point. But this kind of like, people were buying up the heaters and then reselling them, and like, so we were lucky to. We did an interview about how we couldn't find patio heaters, and someone reached out saying, I've got a bunch of patio heaters. So I like drove to some neighborhood and loaded up a U-Haul with like patio heaters for the restaurants. So that's a funny kind of one-off. Our menus by design are very seasonal, and so I think it's not as big of a deal for us to say, oh, I didn't get squash, but I got Brussels sprouts. Okay, that's fine. My side dish will be Brussels sprouts. We're not so attached to, always having the same menu all the time. So I think we were a little bit better suited than some to kind of be adaptive in that way. But for me, the can we pass it on to the customer? We could, but it's sort of this trickle of like, I mean, I used to read all of my invoices and look at like, oh, sugar, okay, it costs this, and I mean, I just can't do that anymore. And so it's kind of this like slow build of, well, expenses seem to be going up, but are they going up in a predictable way? And so I add 1%, to all of my menu items. So for me, it kind of feels like that little creep that you're not quite sure when to respond to in a menu price. We added an administrative fee to our menu to fund basically keeping our entire staff at the wages, the full wage that we pay everybody on our team. So that's less, I think, probably wrapped up into that is, yeah, we're paying twice as much for gloves. But that's a harder, the question is whether you itemize and say, you're paying more for this burger because gloves are more expensive. We've always been talking about labor, and that's sort of our, that's the thing we've chosen to say, this might be more expensive because our employees are paid in a different way than other restaurants are. So.
Thank you. Jody, what about at trade? Can you get the things you need?
No, we couldn't. We were trying to renovate a restaurant. We couldn't get the things that we needed. So my business partner, Eric, said, finally, he said, we're just going to open in stages. And I was like, oh, stages, you can't do that. It has to be like a grand, reveal, the big reveal. And it turned out to be really fun, actually, to have it evolve over time. So it wasn't just the materials to build banquettes and the lighting coming in, but it was actually the vendors who would do the work. Everybody was pulled in so many different directions. There was so much to do that we just completed the restaurant. Actually, there's some lights that still need to go up that are waiting to be hung. So by the end of the week, perhaps it will be somewhat complete. I mean, it should be pretty much complete, and it's incredible. It's a very different feeling restaurant. For any of you who were there pre-pandemic, we opened 10 years ago. It's a very industrial feeling building, high ceilings, big glass windows that look out onto the greenway. And we decided to warm it up with more fabric banquettes and curtains and plants, and so it has a wonderful, much warmer feeling. It's a nice sort of transformation of a gorgeous space. As far as the cost of items, that's been a really tricky, I think, question for all of us, right? The reality is the cost of running a restaurant now as compared to, say, 15 years ago, but particularly even as compared to 2 years ago, has gone up significantly. Everything has. Labor costs have gone up, which is a good thing. Products have gone up. And we have only, not even inched our prices up, which means that we're making less each year in terms of a percentage. We're making less. So we're all trying to figure out how to squeeze that middle section of a P&L so there's something that trickles down to the bottom, and whether that's being more efficient in terms of labor, whether that means owners going back in and doing things they hadn't done before. Eric, my partner, we have 6 restaurants. He said, do you know that for every restaurant, there are 5 people that you have to talk to get your licenses, all of the licenses, liquor licenses and all of that, getting ready for, do you know that there are 5 people, that's 30 people that I had to track down? Poor guy, he was like beside himself. And in the past, we hire somebody who expedites that process. We can't afford to do that right now because of the impact that COVID had on our P&L. So he's doing that. I'm in the kitchen. And so there are a lot of things that have changed. Will we come out the other side? Yes, I think, as Katrina said, we're all hoping that we'll go back to working on our businesses rather than in our businesses in that way. But anyway, it's tricky. It's tricky because we have raised our prices slightly for sure, but not to the degree that we should in terms of what we're paying in increased costs.
Right. And to put a fine point on that, as a very new restaurant owner, relatively speaking, myself, I was horrified to learn that the average profit margin for an independent restaurant prior to COVID is somewhere between 3 and 5%. And so in COVID, I don't even want to know what that number is. But essentially, if you're buying a $10 sandwich, the owner gets 30 or 50 cents to then use to pay taxes and reinvest in fabric banquettes and do all of those things. And so I think that, I'm pretty sure people know we're not getting rich doing this, but I didn't know. And that's how I ended up
That
here.
you weren't getting rich? I thought I was getting rich. And then I looked at my bank account.
So I want to reintroduce.
If I could, pre-COVID, that was the case. When I entered the business, we were talking, you could, like 5 to 10, sometimes people would push 15% profit. I mean, it was a very different world then. So people who are going into the restaurant business right now, it's really a labor of love, and it is not. I've always said it's like having a farm. It's a lifestyle. It's 24/7. It requires, and it's all of you.
It is. I'm really excited that Shamila made it. I want to reintroduce Shamila Ruiz, who is the communications director at One Fair Wage. And I think that this is the perfect time for us to dig a little bit into the great labor shortage of the pandemic. Labor shortage is the phrase we're seeing most in, I think, the press and in conversation. And I'm curious how that phrase lands with you, Shamila, with all the work that you've been doing with workers in our industry.
Great. Thank you so much, Irene, for the warm welcome. Thank you all for coming to this important discussion. Thank you to my panelists. I was able to listen in the car as I was stuck in about 2 hours worth of traffic. That normally takes a 27-minute drive from my house. So I'm so glad that I was actually able to see some of the comments in the chat online in a way that we haven't been exposed to. And there's been some great discussions in the chat. So thank you for those who are here in person. Again, my name is Shamila Ruiz. I'm the Director of Communications at One Fair Wage. More importantly, I worked as a tipped worker in the restaurant industry here in Boston for over 10 years. I worked in fine dining. I've worked in fast casual. I've worked in various different sectors of the Boston restaurant economy. And also, my family owns a food business that's been 30 years strong in downtown Crossing. So thank you so much for bringing that question. I was so glad to see that workers, in a little bit about the One Fair Wage campaign. We're a national campaign coalition to raise the tipped minimum wage for all service industry workers. and put an end to sub-minimum wages in America. What that means here in Massachusetts is that by 2023, tipped workers will be at $6.75 an hour, and everybody else is going to $15 an hour, and we're actually going to have the largest gap between the tipped minimum wage and the overall minimum wage in the country. Right now, we're second to Nebraska, and soon this progressive state of Massachusetts will be paying its tipped workers a third of what everybody else makes in the workforce. So I thank leaders like Katrina and Irene and so many independent small restaurants who have joined forces with One Fair Wage as part of Raise High Road Restaurants to advocate for raising wages as a way to combat this wage shortage that you're talking about. You know, in the press, it's been talked about as the great staffing crisis, as a labor shortage, but the reality is it is a shortage of good paying jobs in the restaurant industry. So I'm so glad that I'm here and able to advocate on behalf of the 6 million workers nationally who lost their jobs during the pandemic. Here in Massachusetts, so many workers were laid off. We saw great relief efforts by so many chefs and organizations to feed out-of-work service industry workers, because those who normally put food on our tables were literally unable to feed their own families as a result of the pandemic. So I just want to make it really clear that the struggles across the state and across the country were felt so hard by restaurant owners and workers alike. It's unfathomable to think of the struggles that tipped workers specifically went through as a result of not having a full minimum wage. Many of them weren't able to access unemployment insurance. We surveyed workers nationally and found that nearly 60% of workers weren't able to access unemployment insurance because of being paid a lower minimum wage. When they went to apply for unemployment, the government told them straight up they didn't qualify. Even though they had been working years, sometimes decades at the same restaurant, they were denied because on paper it looked like they were making too little to qualify for unemployment. It showed that they weren't working. So what we're seeing now, and actually this is the point that I think the media has gotten wrong, is that these workers aren't leaving the industry now. They left March of 2020. They had to find other jobs, right? They weren't able to access unemployment, so they turned to other sectors. And so what happened is that restaurants went to reopen, and here they're saying, where are all the workers? They've been gone, right? They've been moving on to other industries, maybe gig economy or retail or other sectors. We've heard a lot of workers going to construction or different service occupations that pay full wages. And so just to get back to your question, I think it's how we frame that narrative around the worker struggles that's so important, and make it really clear that if you incentivize workers to come back with full fair wages, they will come back to work. It's been hard, I know, for many restaurants across the sector, but we have seen states that don't have a sub-minimum wage, that pay one fair wage, like California, being more resilient as far as their restaurant economies and workers wanting to come back to work for full fair wages.
Thank you, Shamila. I think in my mind, the full fair wage is necessary but not sufficient to address all of the issues that this industry has with employment. Jody, you had a lot of staff across all of your businesses. Did you see a lot of folks leaving the restaurant industry for other kinds of work, and how are we going to get them back?
We held on to a lot of our staff, actually, both tipped employees and kitchen workers. And we did it by keeping our restaurants open in limited kinds of ways. In some cases, some of the Salonikis were opened in limited ways. There were people that certainly left and left town. I mean, we know that people who were not eligible for unemployment, particularly in the beginning months, these are kitchen workers, went to Texas and Florida and places like that where they could get work, and because we couldn't provide it for them. And there are people who left the industry to go into real estate. I think there are a lot of people who went into real estate. Actually, the hardest positions that we're finding to fill are management positions. Those are the people that left the industry that we see, the people who, were working incredibly long hours and perhaps just said, you know what, I just don't want to go back to that industry with that kind of pressure and that kind of stress. It is enormously stressful, and it's incredibly labor intensive. So if you're a manager, there's a huge amount of managing of people and personalities and training and mentoring that goes on, and it's very, very demanding. And so I think, and oftentimes people who come up in through restaurants and into management have received no training as managers. They don't really have a package of skills. And it's a rare, I think it's a rare restaurant that has the resources to provide the kinds of management training that really are required for restaurants.
Yeah. Yeah, somehow being the best line cook qualifies you to become a manager in a lot of places.
Yeah.
Incredible. And I do want to underscore that this actually was an audience question. I'm also so excited about the question. I pretended it was mine. So my apologies to that wonderful audience member. Katrina, right before we came on stage, you scheduled yourself to go back to Peregrine right after this. What has hiring been like for you? I know that you also were able to retain a lot of your staff. What are you seeing, and are there certain incentives that you feel like are working or more compelling for people?
Yeah, so we are, I won't comment on, because it's a curse to comment on your current staffing in a restaurant, because it guarantees something's going to happen. We are in the process of trying to hire lots of people to fill our new restaurant in Somerville. And something that we've seen and are really leaning on is kind of an internal incentive program, like a referral program among our team. We try very hard to create a great work environment for our employees, including leadership style trainings, as well as sort of basic skills that they'll need on the job, but also really pushing down certain responsibilities or empowerment to be engaged in the business in ways that are not always seen. We do that because we think it's a benefit to the business. We get 25 minds working on a challenge or a problem instead of just 2 at the top. So we've always committed to doing that, and sort of getting the word out about, okay, maybe not every restaurant is perfect for you, individual person, but to be able to know someone who says, oh, I work over there, it's really great. We've seen basically right now the Peregrine staff consists of like 2 friend groups who just like said, oh yeah, you should apply, we're hiring, come on over. And so incentivizing both parties to work out essentially has been helpful, and also kind of creates a nice feeling at work where people know each other and get along, and that's sort of a nice added bonus. But it's also a representation of including the team in the operating of the business that they rely on for their wages and their career opportunities, and is obviously super important to the owners of the business. And so it's kind of just another example of, hey, we're short a few servers. You can feel it on Saturday night when we're all running around, a lot faster than we might like to, or ticket times are slower because we're down a line cook. And so it really creates, we share that transparently with the team, and then they're actually able to help us solve that problem instead of sort of waiting for us to fix it in a way that like we can't invent people.
Right.
So.
And a lot of us, oh, Jamila, yeah.
Yeah, I don't want that to be skipped over, because Katrina, what you just said about your business practice, and to your question, Irene, about how do you incentivize growth and incentivize new folks that is not the norm for the restaurant industry at large. What Katrina and Josh have done at Peregrine and Juliet is really a hard thing, to stick their necks out and operate a business model that is taking that, what we call it, one fair wage, the high road to sustainability. They're part of a network of over 2,000 members nationally of small independent restaurants who are putting their employees kind of top tier as far as priorities and as a core element to their profitability and success. And that is so rare in the industry overall. Here in Boston, we have a handful of great leaders, but when you're a really good line cook, like you said, people want to keep you at a line cook position for a long time, or a dishwasher. I remember when I worked in the industry, I was told that I would never make server because I was a really good hostess and they needed me at hostess. So there are so few opportunities for upward mobility. The data and research that we have done points to the fact that it is one of the industries with the least amount of ability to be upwardly mobile, especially for women and people of color, where language might be a barrier, or immigrants, where language might be a barrier, or just cultural biases against moving, who is traditionally going to be a server. I also had a manager once tell me, well, you don't really fit the look of our restaurant, because I wasn't like a white male in my 50s. And that was the norm for their restaurant, right? Fine dining, extensive knowledge of wine service. And so like I studied my butt off and I learned that wine menu. But even still, we have so many kind of barriers that we have to work against as women, as people of color in the industry. And so I just want to shout out Katrina for implementing a system and a culture at Juliet and Peregrine that really prioritizes opportunities for upward mobility and growth within their staff to incentivize them to become the really good managers that our industry needs, and higher tier one wage earning positions. So that's great, and I encourage you all to support high road restaurants overall, and to do your research too, to figure out what restaurants are, how they're treating their employees.
And I think that in conversations about the restaurant industry and about chefs, we hear a lot more about mentorship than maybe we see it. And I think, Jody, you're an amazing example of someone who has incredible staff who have worked for you over the years, who are now everywhere in the restaurant industry. I don't know if everybody here knows that. I did want to go back to your comment, Katrina, that we can't invent people. A lot of folks out there are trying to invent people. We have about 10 minutes left, and so this question I thought was really interesting. Do you think robots will replace some restaurant workers?
Saw that one.
And if yes, in what areas? And I will just say briefly, I got an email today about a robot that serves margaritas. So I don't know if they make them for the home, but that's one possibility for Christmas. And at Maymay, where good jobs are truly a priority for us, we also just bought a giant machine to help us make dumplings. Yeah.
Before we go to robots, I just would like to talk about how a restaurateur like me and my partners, how we build our teams.
Yeah, please.
So we have fast casual restaurants called Saloniki, and they're in Fenway and two in Cambridge. Within the restaurant, there is a very clear pathway for professional growth, and people have moved through the restaurant and become general managers, and that all of our general managers are people who started as line cooks or front line workers, at the counter. The chef de cuisine at Porto is somebody who started as a prep cook, and she worked for me for years and became the chef de cuisine. Her sous chef is somebody who started as a prep cook. In our restaurants, the success of the restaurant is dependent on growth, because if there isn't growth, then somebody like me has to do all that work. And I think, we may do it slightly differently than you do, Juliet, but there are many restaurateurs in the city of Boston and across the country who recognize that the way to have a successful business is to have success at every level and have a team that is interested in what the next step is. In my role as the chef at Trade, the CDC at Trade right now, or the executive chef, whatever my title is, I said to one of my chefs there, what's so incredibly rewarding to me is that every person in the kitchen is interested in growth. They want to grow. They want to take the next step. They want to invest. And every one of them is a native Spanish speaker. So our recipes are all translated into Spanish. And all of them work independently, and they're already in the 2.5 months are making progress and moving through the line and up into positions of leadership. So we may not be a high road kitchen, but we take the high road.
That's great. You should join Raise. But I so appreciate that. I also want to point out that that's not the industry standard for like the Applebee's and the corporations across the state who are taking what we call the low road to profitability. So I was in no way contrasting the business practices of one or the other. It's just the industry standard that is set by these few corporations that hold so much power and dictate the industry standards are not the same as independent. I guess you would consider yourself a medium-sized chain, Saloniki, right? Small to.
Well, it's 3 restaurants. Is that a medium-sized chain?
I think it has to do with the size of employees, but you know,
we're on our road to be. We're on the road to becoming a medium-sized chain. Yes, we are growing,
which is
so,
amazing, and we
evolving.
celebrate you, especially women-owned businesses like that. I was contrasting that practice with the corporate giants that set such a low road standard that don't prioritize upward mobility. So I'm so glad you raised that.
Yeah, and I think that what this like really crystallizes for me is that you can have a positive feedback loop where the owners and the managers really care and they really invest themselves in their staff, and in turn, the staff feels that and it's reflected in their work and the quality of their performance. And you have the exact same negative feedback loop where if the owner doesn't seem to care, then why should the staff care? And then if the staff don't care, why would the owner invest in them? And so it's sort of vicious. And I think that, you know, the question about how you can turn that around in restaurants where the culture is not about investing in people, what we can do in terms of policy that forces and that asks chains, big chains, to lead the way, rather than leave it to independent restaurants to invent these wheels over and over again. That, for me, is one of the big questions about the future of the industry. Because I know so many restaurant owners who say, like, I've just been burned by so many new hires. Like, so no, I'm not gonna give them all my time to orient them to the business. I'm gonna make them work 2 weeks, and then we'll see, you know, what kind of time I have to spend with them. And what a horrible way to start a new job.
That just reminds me, when I first started looking for a job, this was in the early 80s. That's how long ago that was. And I was walking, you know, around Back Bay applying for jobs. And I went to see a very famous chef at the time. And he said, I won't hire you because I was 25. And first of all, he said I was too old, that I was too old to be applying for a line cook position in his restaurant, because he wasn't going to pay me enough to live on. I should have been living at home. Home was Providence if I was going to live with my parents. He wouldn't pay me enough to live on for a year, because why should he invest in me if I wasn't going to prove my investment in him by staying there for a year?
Big mistake, huge, for that chef. I think we have about 5 minutes left. I want to go just briefly to another question, and we can talk about robots as part of this answer if anyone wants to. But Katrina, you mentioned that a positive outcome from all of the brutality of the pandemic is that we have these incredible outdoor dining spaces that never would have happened, that city government would not have approved without the crisis and all of the incredible advocacy of groups like Mass Restaurants United. I'm curious, what other silver linings or positive impacts do we see, and we hope might continue even after we've kicked COVID for good? If anyone would like to start, yeah.
I'll just jump in with, I mean, I think the other great kind of experience and service restaurants are so well suited to provide is around like beverage. So we got to become a retail store, and you could walk into Juliet and be like, "Oh, what was that wine I had last week?" Like, and then you could buy a bottle of it, which you couldn't do before. And so things like that put into question like, oh, is it like, why aren't we allowed to do that? And I don't know actually all the complexity to that, but I'm hoping that things like that get re-examined to say, okay, well, what's the reason behind prohibiting that in the past? Or, you can't have outdoor dining for like it's based on the calendar instead of the weather, like what if it's hot before May 1st? Like I can't serve outside before May 1st. So some of those things that are sort of I can't tell who's benefiting from them, I guess. And so hopefully that could mean,
I think the community, you talked about, can't we use the space for something other than, park cars? And I think that it's changed the dynamic of neighborhoods and gotten people outdoors. And I would love to see it actually expand into colder weather. That Boston, I mean, there are lots of cold weather cities, and frankly, it's turning into a not so cold weather city. But cold weather cities that have a really active outdoor evening and daytime experience. And I think that we would benefit from that. One of the things that I think internally in the restaurants that happened was, and across the industry, is this feeling of connection, and that we did something pretty monumental. I know within each of our restaurants, the teams in those restaurants, the ones that were making meals for frontline hospital workers and for restaurant workers, and we were making meals that were then being distributed to people in Revere through their community health programs and things like that. Everybody that got involved felt like they were a part of something bigger and something really important and something generous, and that connected them with the rest of the city. I hope that doesn't go away. I really hope that we can hold on to that sense of connection.
Forged in fire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's such a perfect tee up for what I was going to say. I'm so glad you brought that up. I think the connection, the empathy, this is something that everybody in this audience and everyone watching can do. The kindness that everybody all of a sudden, for the most part, was exhibiting towards service industry workers and restaurant workers, saying like, thank you, you're essential, you're heroes. Let's keep that going. Let's make sure that the people who put food on our table every single day have the ability to feed their own families, have the ability to have a place to live and take sick time if they need it. Let's be nice to folks. You've seen the signs everywhere when you go out to eat, please be kind, please be patient with it. We should just be kind and patient with people all the time and come from a place of like understanding and empathy, compassion, community. And so I'm so glad that this conversation was brought up, because as we reimagine a restaurant industry in Boston that is like revitalized and goes to a place that we want to see people working in good jobs, and we want to see people going out to eat and being happier. I'm so glad that we have great folks thinking about this issue and leading the way and creating good jobs for those who work in it, and also yummy, delicious food for those who go out to eat. So just be kind. Don't forget that every time you go out to eat, there's a lot of steps that had to happen from the people who grow our food to transport it, to cook it, and serve it to you. So be kind to those folks.
So will there be robots, is the question.
You tell me, Jody. What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I really like working with my hands. I mean, I just really like it. I'm sure that robots, there already are robots, right, frankly, and there are restaurants that have robots, and and there are reasons for robots. I mean, there are reasons for machines. I remember walking into my kitchen one day and seeing a one of my sous chefs kneading pasta dough by hand. And I said, Peter, what are you doing? Like this huge amount of pasta dough by hand. I said, that's why we have that big Hobart over there to do that for you. He said, no, I think it's much better if I do it like this. I said, that's going to take you about 2 hours. That's going to take you about 5 minutes. You know, machines are important. But I really appreciated the fact that he wanted to do it by hand. So
I think about how many times, like, the internet goes down and things. One of the first cautions that Josh gave me when I was like, should we get this manual citrus juicer or this like electric citrus juicer? And he was like, things with a plug, it's gonna break, and you're not gonna. Then it's useless. And so I feel like I don't want any part of. I don't want a robot to replace my workers on a lot of different levels, but a purely like functional level is like, what happens when it breaks and you are so dependent on it to do the thing that you've done with your hands? But I love the example that Jody brought up, because the way we ask the question of like, or one of the things we strive for is to get better problems and use our time for increasingly like more impactful, more interesting, more creative things. So like, sure, I could pay you to knead the pasta dough by hand, but if you weren't doing that, what else could you be like? Could you be inventing a new dish while doing that? And I would much rather pay you for that when there is something to
you know
take
what
away.
his answer would have been?
I can do it while I work.
While I'm kneading the dough is when the
Which
creative.
I agree with. I feel that very, very deeply.
My grandmother would also agree with you. I'm like, Grandma, we have a KitchenAid. She's like, I've never used, I don't know, that just collects dust in the corner.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for this incredible conversation. I feel like we've captured so many pieces of what COVID has been for our industry and what our industry might be as we move forward from it. Thank you all so much for the work that you do on behalf of workers and owners in restaurants. I also want to thank everyone for joining us here in person as well as at home. And I wanted to just give a quick shout out that Jody, you mentioned Jacques Pepin. And if anyone is interested in seeing his interview here at City Space for Curated Cuisine with Cheryl Julian, you can go to WBUR.org. There are lots more curated cuisine events coming up on the calendar, and we look forward to seeing you back at City Space. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Irene.